The summer sun had been relentless, yet to me it felt like a blessing. Each morning I'd walk out to the edge of my property and see the golden stalks of corn stretching toward the sky, proud and tall, their tassels swaying in the warm breeze. It wasn't just a garden project, it was months of labor, sweat, and patience, and I had dreamed of this moment all season. My little cornfield wasn't a sprawling farm by any means, but for someone who worked full-time and tended the plants in the evenings and weekends, it felt like an achievement. Every ear of corn represented determination and pride, but pride wasn't something shared by everyone around me. From the very beginning, Karen, the president of our HOA, had voiced her disapproval. She claimed the cornfield was unattractive and against neighborhood standards, even though the bylaws said nothing about vegetable gardens. In her eyes, the neighborhood should look like the glossy pages of a magazine, perfectly manicured lawns, trimmed hedges, and nothing that stood out. And my corn? Well, it stood out plenty. She'd stop on the sidewalk during her walks, arms crossed, lips pursed, glaring at the rows as if they were some kind of personal insult. I tried to be civil. Once, I even offered her a basket of fresh vegetables from my smaller garden beds, tomatoes, zucchini, cucumbers, but she waved it away like I'd offered her spoiled food. "This isn't farmland," she'd snapped. "This is a neighborhood." After that, I stopped trying to reason with her. The irony was that most of the neighbors admired it. Kids loved running past and calling it the mini farm, and a few elderly residents even told me it reminded them of their childhoods. Some had already asked if they could buy a few ears once the harvest came in. That warmed me more than the sun ever could. As the harvest neared, I started planning a small get-together, roasted corn, lemonade, maybe even a barbecue to celebrate. I imagined laughter, the smell of charred kernels, and a table filled with food grown right from my own soil. Yet, at the back of my mind, I couldn't shake the unease that Karen wouldn't let it end peacefully. I often caught her watching from across the street, her eyes narrowed, calculating. While I saw pride and hard work, she saw something she despised. I had no idea then just how far she'd go to erase what I had built. Do you want me to continue Chapter 2 also in 400 words with the same detailed, dramatic tone? It was late in the evening when I first noticed her lingering again. The sun had just slipped behind the houses, leaving the sky streaked with purple and orange, and the air carried that familiar earthy scent of ripening crops. I was gathering tools in the shed when I saw Karen across the street, pacing slowly along the sidewalk. Her arms were folded tight, and her mouth moved as if she were muttering to herself. From where I stood, she looked like a woman wrestling with her own thoughts, her eyes darting toward my cornfield every few seconds. I tried to ignore her, telling myself she was just on one of her usual inspection walks. That was her excuse every time she wandered the neighborhood, clipboard in hand, searching for rule violations that barely existed. Still, there was something different about her that night. She didn't carry her clipboard, and the way she stared at my field made my stomach tighten with unease. Later, when I stepped inside for dinner, the peace didn't last. A faint but sharp scent began to drift through the open kitchen window smoke. At first, I thought maybe a neighbor had fired up their grill, but within moments the smell thickened, acrid and biting. My heart thudded as I rushed outside, and that's when I saw it. Thin tendrils of gray rising from the edge of my cornfield. Panic surged as I sprinted across the yard. The flames were small at first, licking the dry husks, but they spread with terrifying speed. The crackle of burning stalks filled the night air, and the fire seemed to leap from row to row as though it had been waiting for a spark. And then, through the haze, I saw her. Karen was standing near the fence line, her face pale in the glow. She wasn't calling for help, wasn't trying to put it out. Instead, she clutched something in her hand, something that glimmered briefly before she shoved it into her pocket. For a split second, our eyes locked. and the realization hit me like a punch. She had done this. Out of spite, out of some twisted sense of control, she had struck the match that turned months of work into kindling. Yet, the fire she thought she could control was already out of her grasp, the flames growing wilder with every second. What she didn't know was that her recklessness would soon come back to her in ways she never imagined. Do you want me to move on? And expand Chapter 3 in 400 words with the same suspenseful style? The moment I pulled my phone from my pocket and dialed 911, my hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped it. My voice came out louder than I intended as I told the dispatcher about the fire spreading through my cornfield. Within minutes, the distant wail of sirens pierced the night, a sound both terrifying and relieving. I glanced back at Karen, who was now pacing near the sidewalk, wringing her hands. The smug confidence she usually wore had vanished, replaced with wide darting eyes and shallow breaths. She looked less like a woman in charge and more like someone who had cornered herself with her own actions. Neighbors began pouring out of their homes, drawn by the thick smoke and the orange glow illuminating the street. A few rushed toward me, asking if I needed help with a hose or buckets of water, but the fire was already too aggressive for anything we had on hand. The stalks that once stood tall and proud were collapsing into blackened husks, and the heat pressed against us like a wall. Then the fire trucks turned the corner, their lights washing the houses in flashing red. Firefighters leapt into action with practiced precision, unrolling hoses and shouting commands. Streams of water hissed as they hit the flames, sending plumes of steam into the night. The crowd of neighbors stood in stunned silence, whispering to each other, their gazes flicking back and forth between the burning field and Karen, who was hovering uncomfortably near them. That was when she made her mistake. In a shaky voice, she blurted out that she had seen a couple of teenagers running off right before the fire started. It was a desperate attempt to shift suspicion, but her words fell flat. People exchanged skeptical looks, and one of the neighbors muttered, "What teenagers?" "We didn't see anyone but you." Her hands betrayed her, too. As she fumbled to adjust her sweater, the faint glint of charred gloves peeked out from her pocket. Another neighbor gasped softly, and suddenly all eyes were on her. Karen's face flushed crimson under the fire truck lights, her excuses stumbling over themselves as firefighters and police began to take notice. What had started as her crusade to destroy my cornfield was now turning into a spectacle of her own undoing. And unlike the flames, this was not something she could douse with water. Shall I continue and expand Chapter 4 in 400 words to bring the full climax and resolution? The firefighters worked tirelessly until the last of the flames hissed into submission, leaving behind nothing but smoldering stalks and a bitter stench that clung to the night air. My once proud harvest was reduced to blackened ash, the fruits of months of work gone in less than an hour. I stood there numb, watching the smoke curl upward like ghosts of what had been, when the sharp beam of a flashlight snapped me back to reality. 2 police officers had arrived and were moving through the crowd, speaking to neighbors and jotting down notes. Karen was at the center of it all, her voice shrill as she repeated her claim about the teenagers she had supposedly seen. But the more she talked, the more tangled her story became. One moment she insisted they were tall boys with hoodies. The next she said she couldn't see their faces at all. Her words contradicted themselves, and whispers rippled through the gathered crowd. Some neighbors stepped forward, telling the officers they'd seen no one else near the field, only Karen. The officers turned their attention to her, their flashlights lingering on her trembling hands. One of them calmly asked her to empty her pockets. For a second, Karen froze, her lips parting as though she might refuse. But the weight of a dozen watching eyes pressed on her, and reluctantly she pulled out the half-burned gloves, their fingertips blackened and still reeking faintly of smoke. A hush fell over the crowd, broken only by the crackle of cooling embers. Her excuses spilled out in a rush. She had only been trying to stop the fire," she claimed. She had found the gloves near the field, but her words were weak, and her face betrayed the panic she was desperate to hide. The officers exchanged a glance, one scribbling in his notepad while the other asked her to step aside for more questions. The once dominant HOA president, who had lorded rules and threats over us all, now stood cornered and exposed under the harsh glow of flashing lights. As for me, I felt a swirl of emotions: grief for the harvest I had lost, anger at the malice behind its destruction, but also a grim sense of justice. Karen's fire had consumed more than my corn. It had burned through her authority, her credibility, and her carefully maintained image of control. She had wanted to erase what I had built, but instead she had set fire to her own reputation. And as the night drew on, it became clear that the flames had left her with scars far deeper than the ones in my field.